And I do appreciate the opportunity to speak today about community resilience, what's happening in Southeast Florida and Broward County, and how we're working as local governments and regional agencies to support climate resilience. And I think in large part we think about resilience in terms of the stability and predictability in the physical environment and our ability to provide for some of the really basic fundamental services that have supported the development, the livability, economic investment in our region. And what we are seeing is that there is this clear erosion in system function that is indicative of how climate change is already affecting our communities, and individuals and businesses are making investment decisions today based upon these economic losses, exposures, and concerns about the future. Many of our communities were working individually on climate resiliency initiatives going back a decade. A lot of what's happening in the most recent past has been as a four-county collaborative in the last 5 years. And I'll talk a bit about those efforts. I do want to just share some of the characteristics of Broward and our region for those who may not be familiar. You know, Broward County is located right here, but the 4 counties of Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, and Monroe make up Southeast Florida. Broward's very indicative in the terms of development of what our region looks like. We have intense coastal development. We're very flat, low land elevations, extensive shorelines. We're kind of sandwiched between very prized and valuable natural systems, the Everglades, which have already been mentioned, our coastal oceans. And because of our physical characteristics, we have a history of vulnerabilities as it relates to, you know, storm surge, extreme rain events, and trying to manage for these extremes. We have elaborate flood and drainage control systems, but the thing is that these have all been based upon historic physical conditions. And while we intensely analyze, you know, rainfall distributions and develop flood maps to help gear our planning investment decisions, we know that the underlying factors have changed. The systems are no longer meeting the needs of the community today, and they're certainly not going to be protective based upon the anticipated climate impacts. And again, we're already seeing evidence. Coastal flooding associated with extreme high tides, it's growing more frequent, more expansive, more severe. It's characteristic of many communities, I know, but the saltwater flooding isn't isolated to our coastal environments either. We have a very extensive and interconnected drainage and flood control system. All of Broward County, from the coast to the inland communities, are all reliant upon the ability to discharge water via gravity to the tide. And as sea level rises, the entire system loses capacity. We have stormwater systems that discharge directly to tide, and during these high tide events, like some other communities, saltwater backs up, and so this is saltwater flooding of a neighborhood, a community that is not waterfront. And you can imagine when you have that type of compromising of your drainage infrastructure, what happens with these extreme rainfall events where you literally can't move the water. There's no place for it to go. And we're seeing more and more severe rainfall events. Florida had 2 1-in-1,000-year rainfall events last year. Massive amounts of rainfall, 22 inches in 24 hours. And these events are also happening during atypical times of year, during our winter dry months. In fact, I think all of these were, well, this one was a fall event, but these other 2, normally it's not raining in the winter. So this is quite extreme. We're also seeing the early indications of how our coastal infrastructure is likely to fare with increases in sea level. The image shown here is a result of not a storm event, but 2 separate months of prolonged onshore winds during extreme high tide event. The first event eroded the beach. A month later, the A1A, which is an emergency evacuation route in Fort Lauderdale, collapsed. And it provides us this exposure to what, again, future nominal events could generate in the way of economic damages and vulnerable infrastructure with additional sea level rise. Another concern for our communities, and one that's not immediately apparent to everyone, is the vulnerability of our water supplies. We have a very porous aquifer that supports all of South Florida, the Biscayne Aquifer. We know that saltwater intrusion has been a condition that has plagued our aquifer. Some of that's been driven by water management and use, but about 50% of the documented intrusion is a result of sea level rise. And in Broward County, we anticipate, as a basis of recent hydrologic modeling with the USGS, that we'll lose about 35 million gallons per day in additional capacity in the next several decades. That's 40% of coastal well field capacity. That matters because of all of the associated infrastructure that's tied to water supply development in our region. And that's, of course, independent of additional growth and water that's needed for additional populations and industrial development, commercial activities. We are investing in resiliency measures. Many of our communities, though, are taking something of a patchwork approach. I don't think we have yet the sort of collective organization of resources that's needed for comprehensive implementation of plans, but rising of seawalls, of course. We're installing, many of our municipalities, one-way valves on those stormwater systems. You can see how much reduced the flooding is with an equivalent high tide event. We had the example from Miami Beach. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in stormwater management infrastructure. We've had an example earlier about the armoring. We are very much focused on trying to ensure the preservation of natural infrastructure and not hard armoring in our environment. However, with the collapse of A1A, we came back in, reforced underneath the roadway, but it was set back, and we installed dune features along the length to help ensure that under a future condition, we've got a greater buffer against that tidal energy. And that actually prompted on large scale installations of dunes throughout many of the Broward County municipalities and regionally. So it has raised awareness about the importance of kind of transitioning the way we've thought about shoreline protection historically. I want to note that we're also integrating climate change throughout our comprehensive plans. In our land use plans, we've adopted maps that delineate areas at increased risk of flooding with 2-foot sea level rise. We have to view proposed development under that condition. We also have a provision in state law that allows local governments to adopt or identify adaptation action areas for the purpose of organizing projects and resources to support resiliency specifically tied to sea level rise and coastal flooding. And we're exploring that and making those amendments. There are examples of resiliency efforts on large scales in other communities, like the Dutch dialogues and Rebuild by Design. We've sought to employ similar sorts of initiatives in our community. And this is really about bringing together the diversity of practitioners and professionals that participate in every layer of project planning and development, that they're the decision makers, they're influencing in some way an investment or a project or a program. We want them to be exposed to these issues. And outside of these types of events, many of them are not having those conversations. And we're involving the Florida Chamber and bringing it to the 6 pillar processes, which is our state's economic development process. We just had an event last week. We are upgrading our hydrologic models to integrate sea level rise so that when we develop new standards, they're not just reflective of the change in our current condition as we see it now, but predictive of what we anticipate in a couple of decades. And that is an important investment that's happening in Broward County, Miami-Dade as well. We're coupling our models with visualization tools so we can better communicate risk and the importance of economic and investments in infrastructure that support economic stability. We're diversifying water supplies. We've been working for a decade to develop a regional water project that captures stormwater, mitigates flooding, and supports water supply development in our region, reclaimed water conservation. But really the point is that we're integrating climate change across all of the sorts of planning processes that local and regional governments participate in, really ensuring its diffusion throughout all the tools that are already readily available to us. And then I just want to close in noting again that what's happening in Southeast Florida isn't just about individual local governments or individual counties, but we are working formally across all of the 4 counties identified in regional planning, including mitigation and adaptation for climate resilience. And that's as part of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. And hopefully we have a chance to talk more about any of those planning details later. And that concludes my remarks.